everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about, honestly, one of the most insane cases I think I've ever researched. I came across this case a while ago now and I've been intending to cover it ever since because it is so crazy how this case unfolded, how it was solved. This week's case is about Carrie Ann Jopak. She was a young girl who mysteriously disappeared one day while she was just walking home. Sadly, Carrie Ann would later be found murdered, and despite there being a couple of suspects in the investigation, her case went cold. However, more than 3 decades after the crime, there was an absolutely huge development in this murder inquiry when a confession was made to the police. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a special thank you to Best Fiends for kindly sponsoring this section of the video. I am so excited to be working with Best Fiends again because I have been playing this game for such a long time now. I'm completely obsessed with it. Best Fiends is a free to download puzzle adventure game where you solve thousands of fun puzzles and collect these really cute little characters called fiends. It's like Friends but without the R, and the fiends act as a little team to help you defeat the evil slugs. Honestly, I can spend hours on this game. I've been playing it a lot recently in the evenings. It's my favourite thing to do whilst I'm just laying in bed watching TV. It's a really nice game to play whilst you are relaxing and trying to unwind, but also at the same time it really gets your brain going. It's so engaging and it can get quite tricky because you have to work out how to solve the puzzles and complete each level, and obviously the levels get a little bit harder as you progress through the game. I think I'm currently on level like 118 or something like that. I just get so invested in the game and also a little bit competitive too, I'm not gonna lie. I've got my sister to start playing it and she also loves it and we're kind of competing against each other now. We always compare who's further in the game, like who has completed the most levels. Honestly, you guys need to check out Best Fiends. I just know you will enjoy it as much as I enjoy it. So you can download the game for free using my link below in the description box, and if you go through my link you will be able to get $5 worth of gold and energy for free if you beat level 5. Once again, thank you so much to Best Fiends for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to you guys for always supporting the sponsors on this channel, and now let's just get into the case. So for this case, we are going back about 40 years to the year 1982 in the city of Milwaukee, which is located in the state of Wisconsin in the US. And this is Carrie Ann Jopak. She was a 13-year-old girl who was born in Milwaukee in Wisconsin, so she had lived there all her life. Carrie Ann was born on the 17th of August 1968. Her mother's name was Carolyn, and I couldn't actually find the name of her father. However, her mother and father were not together at the time that this case happened. They'd separated, but Carrie still saw her father and kept in regular contact with him. Carrie's mother Carolyn had a new partner by 1982. His name was Fred and he lived with the family. He became Carrie's stepfather, and Carrie was the oldest of 2 children. She had a little sister named Maggie. Carolyn described her daughter Carrie as being a very beautiful young girl who was creative and artistic. She loved drawing and singing. She was smart. She did well in school. She was the kind of girl that really could have done anything, achieved anything that she put her mind to. And she was a very, very headstrong young girl. Her mother said that Carrie, even though she was only 13 years old, she was kind of the ruler of the house. She was the big boss. She very much liked getting her own way. She could be a bit of a rebel, to be honest, sometimes. I mean, she was a teenage girl. I feel like most teenagers go through a rebellious stage where they don't really listen to their parents, and that was the kind of stage that Carrie was going through at this point at 13 years old. She was close to her mother and her stepfather too, I think, but equally she did argue with them quite often. But again, this isn't really out of the ordinary for a teenage girl. I remember when I was Carrie's age, I was constantly arguing with my parents, thinking that I knew better than them. So Carrie was really just like any other teenage girl in that sense. She could be quite bossy and mouthy sometimes, but deep down, she was a really nice, good person. Carrie and her family lived in a house in an area called Mitchell Street in Milwaukee, which was, by all accounts, a very nice, friendly and safe neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. All the neighbors knew each other and they got on really well. All the children in the area knew each other and they would play together. And Carrie was no exception to this. She would often hang out with the local teenagers. She had a lot of friends. The 16th of March 1982 was a school day for Carrie. She was a pupil in the 7th grade at the Kosciuszko Middle School. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, but it was very close to where she lived. Her school was literally like 300 yards away from her house, so it was within walking distance. And the 16th of March started like any other day for Carrie Ann Jopak. She got up that morning, she went to school. However, she wasn't actually at school for very long before she got suspended and was sent home. The reason for her suspension differs depending on which source you read. A couple of sources say that she was suspended because she was caught skipping classes and just walking the halls without a hall pass. However, a documentary that I watched about this case said that she was suspended because that morning a boy, another student, had thrown paint at Carrie and it got on her shirt, and so she got angry and she reacted to this by hitting the boy. Either way, she was sent home by the teachers at around lunchtime, and she told her friends that she was dreading going home because she knew that her parents, her mum and her stepdad, were going to be really annoyed and disappointed with her for getting suspended. After Carrie was sent home, the school actually rang her mother Carolyn to let them know what had happened, and so Carolyn waited in the house for Carrie to get back. She decided not to go and pick Carrie up from school. She decided to just let her walk home, which was fine because it was the middle of the day and it was a walk that Carrie knew very well and had done many times before. However, for some reason on this particular day, Carrie actually disappeared during her walk. She never returned home. Carrie's mum waited for her daughter to walk through the front door, but she didn't. There was no sign of her. And I think initially Carolyn didn't really worry too much. I mean, we've talked about the fact that Carrie could be quite rebellious at times, so maybe she had just, you know, gone off somewhere else for a bit on her own. She may have been stalling going home, putting it off because she knew that she was in trouble. She knew that her mum would be angry at her for the suspension. So Carolyn didn't really think much of it at first when Carrie didn't come home straight away, but as the hours went by and Carrie still wasn't back, she did start to get a little bit anxious. So Carolyn left the home and she decided to walk across the street to the home of Carrie's best friend, a girl named Robin Mant, who I believe Carrie went to school with. Robin lived literally just opposite Carrie's house. So Carolyn went to Robin's house to see if Carrie was there. However, Robin said no, she wasn't. She hadn't really seen Carrie all day. So following this, Carolyn decided to speak to other friends of Carrie. She contacted them asking if her daughter was with any of them or if they knew where she was. However, they also said no, they had no idea where Carrie was, and by this point it was dark outside. It was now the evening and Carrie still hadn't returned home, and her mother Carolyn just knew that something was off here. She said to her husband Fred, Carrie's stepfather, that something was wrong, something had to be wrong. Carolyn went out with a group of her friends and they all started to search the whole street for Carrie. They were shouting her name and asking neighbours if they had seen her. I think they were searching pretty much all through the night. but to no avail. They had no luck in finding Carrie. And so the next day, when Carrie still hadn't turned up, her mum Carolyn got in contact with the Milwaukee police and she reported her daughter as missing. So a missing persons investigation began, and I think at first the police believed that Carrie Ann Jopak was probably a runaway. As I've said, she was probably nervous about facing her mum and stepdad after getting suspended, and so the police theorized that maybe she decided to just not face them. Maybe she decided to just go away for a while. But if that was the case, where had she run away to? We know that she wasn't with any of her friends because Carolyn checked in with all of them. So who was she staying with? The police decided to track down Carrie's father, her biological father, thinking that maybe she decided to go and stay with him. So the police got in contact with him and they asked him if his daughter Carrie was at his house, but he said no, she wasn't there. He said that he was working all day on the day that she went missing and he hadn't heard from her. So following this, the police decided to retrace Carrie's steps on the afternoon that she disappeared. We know that she left her school at around lunchtime at around 1:30 p.m. and she set off to walk back home, but she never made it. And like I mentioned earlier, it was a short walk. It wasn't like it was a long journey. The distance from her school to her home was about 300 yards. It would have taken her minutes to get home. So what happened to her? What happened to her along that very short route that meant that she didn't get there? Well, to try and find out, the police decided to speak to and take statements from all of the people that lived in the houses along the route that Carrie would have walked to see if they remembered having seen Carrie that day or seen anything strange or suspicious. But unfortunately, this didn't really result in anything either. None of the occupants of these houses could recall having seen anything weird or out of place. So this was another setback. In a bid to generate more awareness of Carrie's disappearance, her family created some missing posters with Carrie's face on and her description, and they put these up all over the neighborhood so that hopefully more people would be on the lookout for Carrie and the police would receive some tips and leads. Her mother Carolyn also got in contact with the people that ran the local newspaper. She asked if they could put Carrie's picture in the paper, which they did. Carolyn was really doing everything that she could possibly think of to try and find out what had happened to her daughter, from putting up these missing posters to actually going out herself and searching the area and asking anyone and everyone if they had seen Carrie. But I think as the days went by, she really started to lose hope. She feared the worst because she knew that Carrie would have gotten in contact by now. If she had run away, she would have called her mum by now because she wouldn't have wanted her to worry for this long. But no contact was made by Carrie, so it wasn't looking good. So as the investigation continued, the police were following up on different lines of inquiry and also coming up with theories as to what might have happened. As I said, they had a theory that maybe Carrie had run away. Another theory that they had was that maybe she had a secret boyfriend that her family didn't know about and she was staying with him, so they were looking into that possibility. And they were also looking at the family, which is something that the police have to do really in every missing persons case, because often the family are involved somehow. They perhaps know more than they're letting on. In this case in particular, the police started looking very, very closely at Carrie's stepfather, Fred. They actually became very suspicious of him. And the reason for this was because the police found out that not long after Carrie went missing, I believe, Fred actually did some work in his garden. He laid a new concrete patio in the back garden, which raised some alarm bells for the police. They started thinking that maybe he was possibly involved in his stepdaughter's disappearance. Maybe Fred killed Carrie, buried her in the back garden, and then laid a new patio over her grave to cover up what he had done. After after all, they did argue quite a lot. As I touched on earlier, Carrie would have arguments with both her mum and her stepdad. She was quite a loudmouthed young girl. She hated being told what to do, and this caused her to clash with her parents a lot, especially her stepfather Fred, because he hadn't been in her life for a long time, I don't think. According to one source, he had begun a relationship with Carrie's mother Carolyn about 4 years before this case took place, when Carrie was around 8-9 years old. So Carrie wouldn't really listen to Fred when he tried to tell her what to do or how to behave. When he tried to enforce some rules in the house, she didn't think that she had to follow them because he was her stepfather, not her real father. So this, paired with the fact that Fred had laid a new patio after Carrie's disappearance, made him stand out to the police, and they thought that they should probably look at him as a potential suspect in the case. So Fred was taken in for a questioning, and he was asked by the detectives if he knew the whereabouts of Carrie, if he had anything to do with whatever had happened to her, and he said no. He said he was innocent and that he would never ever hurt Carrie. Yes, they would argue sometimes, but at the end of the day, he loved her. He saw her as his own daughter. But of course, the police couldn't just take his word for it. They had to keep looking into him, and they decided that they had to look underneath his freshly laid concrete patio. And so to do this, they used a piece of equipment called a ground penetrating radar, which basically uses radio waves to capture images below the surface of the ground without having to actually dig the ground up, or in this case dig the patio up. So they used this equipment to get some pictures of what was underneath Fred's new patio to see if maybe Carrie was under there, but she wasn't. There was nothing under the patio, and so eventually Fred was ruled out as a suspect, and so were the rest of Carrie's family. The police were certain that they had nothing to do with Carrie's disappearance. Meanwhile, as all of this was going on, the police were also following up on any tips and leads that they received from the public, and they actually did receive quite a few. They actually received a number of potential reported sightings of Carrie from all over the area and even surrounding areas, although I don't believe any of these could really be confirmed. They all led to dead ends. But even Carrie's own mother Carolyn thought that she saw Carrie one day. She was on her way to the shop and she saw a young girl that looked very similar. She was about the same height as Carrie, she had the same kind of hair, and so Carolyn thought that it was her, so she started shouting, "Carrie, Carrie," but it wasn't Carrie. It was just a girl that looked like her, which just breaks my heart for Carolyn. It must have been so upsetting for her, thinking in that moment that she had found her daughter and then realizing that she was just mistaken. It's so sad. But back to the police, they were really struggling with this case, to be honest with you. They weren't really getting anywhere. Every single tip and lead that they received just led nowhere. Every line of inquiry they looked into resulted in nothing. They had no idea what happened to Carrie. They didn't even know if she was dead or alive. They didn't really have anything to investigate, anyone to investigate, and so in an attempt to possibly identify some new suspects or people of interest, they decided to once again speak to Carrie's family just to find out some more about Carrie's life and the people in it. Did Carrie have any enemies, people that she didn't like? Did she have a boyfriend that they knew of, or did they know of any boys that were kind of interested in her, had a crush on her? And actually the family said yes. Her mother Carolyn said that there was one boy that she could think of that she thought might have been interested in Carrie. He'd shown a bit of an interest towards her. This boy was named Johnny Mant. He was 17 years old and he was actually the older brother of Carrie's best friend, Robin Mant. So Carrie and Johnny knew each other pretty well, and Carrie's mum wasn't happy about this interest that Johnny had in her daughter. She was a bit worried about it, not just because he was quite a bit older, but also because he was a troublemaker. I don't know whether Johnny was known to the police or not prior to this case, but he actually had a bit of a history of committing crimes. He committed petty theft. He would sell illegal pills to a lot of the other teenagers who lived locally. He would also sell them weed. There were also rumours that he would provide teenagers who were much younger than him with cigarettes and alcohol, so he did not have the best reputation in the local area. And it turns out that Carrie even told her mum not long before she disappeared that Johnny Mant had tried it on with her. He made a pass at her even though he was 17 and she was only 13. And he lived very, very close to Carrie's house. His home was just opposite Carrie's. So the police began thinking that maybe Johnny Mant had something to do with this case. Perhaps on the afternoon that she disappeared, Carrie went to Johnny's house for some reason. He tried it on with her once again, and when she turned him down, he got angry and turned violent and he killed her. So Johnny was brought in for questioning. He was asked if he had any involvement in this case, to which he replied no, he had nothing to do with Carrie's disappearance. So he was asked what he was doing on the day that Carrie vanished, and he said that that afternoon he was just at home on his own, which wasn't a great answer for the police because obviously if he was home alone, there's no one to confirm that. No one can give him an alibi. So they were still quite suspicious of him, but at the same time, there was nothing to link him to Carrie's disappearance. No evidence to say that he had something to do with whatever had happened to her, and so they couldn't do anything. They couldn't arrest him, and so after his interviews with police, he was let go. And unfortunately, following this, the case just started to go cold. As the weeks and the months went by, the investigation just started to slow down. The police stopped receiving as many tips and leads, and any leads that they did receive, again, just seemed to lead them nowhere. They were no closer to finding out what happened to Carrie Ann Jopak, why she disappeared that afternoon in March of 1982. But then in early September of 1983, about a year and 6 months after Carrie went missing, there was a huge development in this case when a dead body was found. It was the 2nd of September 1983 when a local man, a local builder named Conrad, was asked to do some work at one of the houses in Carrie's neighbourhood. One of the houses opposite Carrie's house, actually. The family that lived in this house asked Conrad to do some work in their back garden. They wanted him to basically take down the old decking in their back garden and then I believe build a new one, a new deck. So Conrad did just that. He took the old deck out and then he began levelling the ground in the garden, levelling the earth to start building the new deck. However, as Conrad started digging the soil in one area in the garden, he suddenly smelt something. There was a really horrific, foul smell coming from the ground, and it wasn't long before Conrad realised what the source of the smell was. It was a dead human body. A dead body had been found in this garden, buried in a rather shallow grave, and this body would later be identified as 13-year-old Carrie Ann Jopak, who had vanished while she was walking home from school just under 18 months earlier. And guess whose house this was? Whose back garden Carrie was found buried in? The Mant family's. Carrie's dead body was found in the garden of one of the previously main suspects in the case, 17-year-old Johnny Mant. So as soon as Conrad made this awful discovery, he obviously contacted the police, who rushed straight to the scene. As I said, Carrie was in a rather shallow grave. She was only buried 5 inches down, beneath 5 inches of dirt and soil, and she was kind of curled up in the fetal position. And news that a body had been found spread like wildfire throughout the local community, and soon enough there wasn't just police at the scene. Pretty much all of the people that lived locally, all of the neighbours, had come out of their houses and they just stood outside the manse home eager to find out what was going on. And this included Carrie's own family, her mother Carolyn and her stepfather Fred. They went to the manse home after learning that a body had been found because they just wanted to know if it was Carrie, which of course it was. However, they did have to wait a couple of days for this to be confirmed through dental records and also the clothing that she was found in, because Carrie's body was very, very badly decomposed when she was found. She was literally just skeletal remains, indicating that she had been there. She had been dead for a long time, probably ever since she disappeared about 1.5 years earlier. In fact, when Carrie was found, she was wearing the same clothes that she had been wearing on that day, so it was pretty clear that she had died shortly after she went missing. Carrie's remains were taken for an autopsy, and surprisingly, despite the advanced state of decomposition, the coroner was actually able to determine Carrie's cause of death. Her cause of death was from a broken C1 vertebrae at the top of her neck, so a broken bone in her neck. Her neck had been snapped basically, and I believe this led to some bleeding in her skull, so that was how she died. But the coroner couldn't determine exactly what led to this, whether she was maybe stamped on, like someone stamped on her neck, whether she was hit with a heavy object and that was what caused the break, or whether it was maybe the result of like whiplash. Maybe she was violently pushed and she fell and hit her head and her neck just snapped. They also couldn't determine whether Carrie had been sexually assaulted by the perpetrator because of the fact that she was just a skeleton by the time that she was found. But now that Carrie's dead body had been discovered, the police hunt was on to catch the person responsible, to find out who killed Carrie and then buried her in a shallow grave in that back garden. And of course, the very first person that the police looked at was Johnny Mant. I mean, how could they not? They already thought that he was suspicious when Carrie was just missing, and now her body had been found literally in his garden. Obviously, he was going to be the top suspect. Interestingly, when Carrie's body was found and the police and neighbours fled to the scene, people actually witnessed Johnny Mant being physically sick. He just threw up when the police were digging up the remains. Now, this, of course, could have just been an innocent reaction. I mean, if a body was being dug up in my garden, I would probably be sick too. I think a lot of people would be. But the police started thinking that maybe Johnny was sick because he was guilty. He was the killer. He was the one who murdered Carrie and buried her body. And he threw up because he panicked and he thought that the police were going to arrest him. Finally, he was going to be caught for this. So Johnny was taken to the police station to be questioned again, and he still stuck to his original story. He said that he had absolutely nothing to do with Carrie's death and he had no clue how she ended up being buried in his back garden. Eventually, Johnny Mant got himself a lawyer, and once again, the police actually had to let him go. Despite how suspicious this situation looked, the police still didn't necessarily have any solid, concrete evidence to connect him to the crime. Yes, Carrie's body was found in his garden, which is so strange, but it doesn't necessarily prove that he was the one who buried her there. And so he was released without charge, but that didn't stop him from being the top suspect in the case. He was let go, but in the eyes of the detectives, he was the most likely killer, or at least he knew more than he was letting on. Maybe he didn't kill Carrie, but he perhaps knew who did. And the reason the police started to develop this little theory was because of some rumours that had begun to spread around the local area. These rumours were that on the afternoon that Carrie went missing, there was actually a party held at Johnny Mant's house. Whilst his family were out that day, whilst he had a free house, he threw threw a party to which many of the local teenagers attended. So upon hearing these rumours, the police started to speculate that if they were true, maybe that's where Carrie went on the day that she disappeared. Maybe after she was sent home from school, while she was walking home, she heard the noise of the party as she approached the man's house and she decided to go inside. Or it's also been theorized that maybe Carrie knew that a party was being held that afternoon. Maybe Johnny Mant invited her to it, and so Carrie purposefully tried to get suspended and sent home from school that day so that she could attend. And then while she was there, someone murdered her and buried her in the garden, probably the party host, Johnny Mant. We talked earlier about how Johnny was interested in Carrie. He made a pass at her, so maybe he tried again at the party. He tried it on with her, and when she turned him down a second time, he was really mad and he killed her. However, these party rumours were literally just that. They were rumours. Unfortunately, the police were unable to confirm whether they were true or not, whether a party actually happened. Johnny Mant himself said that it didn't. There was no party that afternoon, and the majority of the other teenagers who supposedly attended this party also said the same thing. There wasn't one. So because they couldn't confirm it, the police obviously couldn't determine if Carrie had attended this so-called party, and therefore they still couldn't establish what happened to her, prove what sequence of events led to her death. However, it wasn't much longer until the police had a new line of inquiry to investigate in this case. You see, less than a week after Carrie was discovered, detectives were contacted by a member of the local community, a neighbour, who said that he had recently seen a young man near the scene where Carrie's body was found, near the Mant's back garden. This young man was on his own. He was on his knees and he was clearly very, very upset and distressed. He was crying. According to a couple of sources, he apparently kept raising his hands up, kind of like this. So the neighbour who witnessed this thought that it was quite strange, and they decided to get in contact with the police and just let them know what they had seen, just in case it could have possibly been of any significance in this murder inquiry. Luckily, the neighbour could actually provide the police with a name. They recognised the young man that they saw. They knew who it was. It was a boy named Jose Ferreira. He was 17 years old, so a couple of years older than Carrie, and he lived on the same street as her and the Mant family. I believe he lived just a couple of houses down from Johnny Mant. So he would have known Carrie and Carrie would have known him. As I said towards the start of the video, this was a neighbourhood where really everyone knew everyone. But the two, Jose and Carrie, didn't know each other that well, I don't think. They knew of each other, but they weren't like really good friends by any means. And so for this reason, the police did become quite suspicious of him. They thought it was really strange that he was seen by that neighbour near the scene where Carrie's body was found, on his knees and crying. If he didn't know Carrie that well, why was he so upset? Was it perhaps because he was guilty of something? So Jose Ferreira was questioned by the police about this, and he said that he just felt very down about what had happened to Carrie. Although he didn't know her too well, he felt really sad about her death, and he went to the scene because he just wanted to pay his respects. So then the police decided to ask him about the party that was rumoured to have happened at Johnny Mant's house on the afternoon that Carrie went missing. They asked him if he attended the party, since he was one of the local teenagers. However, he said the same as Johnny and the rest of the teenagers that were questioned. He said that there was no party. And so, with no evidence to prove that he was lying or to prove that he was involved in this murder, Jose Ferreira was also released without charge. The police continued investigating the case. They still followed up on any tips and leads. They still questioned people and looked into into potential suspects, but as time went on, the case started to go cold once again, and this time it stayed cold for a number of years. For such a long time, her family were just left with no answers and no justice for Carrie's murder. It must have just been torture for them knowing that her killer was still out there somewhere. They were just free to live their life even though they took Carrie's life away from her. However, more than 3 decades after Carrie's murder, there was a major breakthrough in her cold case, and this breakthrough completely shocked everyone that had ever been involved in this case or had ever even known about this case. More than 33 years after Carrie's death, on the morning of the 11th of October 2015, a journalist who worked for the Milwaukee news station WISN answered a call that came into the newsroom. This journalist's name was Justin Adams. Justin picked up the phone, and on the other end of the line was a man. And straight away, this man said, quote, "I want to confess to a murder." Of course, at first, Justin didn't really think that this guy was being serious, but he let him talk anyway. And eventually, the man on the phone confessed that he was Carrie Ann Jopak's killer. The man on the phone didn't tell Justin his name, and shortly after his confession, he just hung up, and Justin got in contact with the police to let them know what had just happened. However, the police didn't even have to really try and track down the man that made this anonymous call, because just 2 days later, he handed himself in to the police. The man that confessed to being Carrie Ann Jopak's killer was Jose Ferreira, the 17-year-old boy who was previously a suspect or person of interest in the case all those years ago in the early 1980s, was now a fully grown middle-aged man. Jose would have been in his early 50s by this point in 2015, and as I said, in October of 2015, he turned himself in. He said that he was Carrie Ann's killer. Now, when Jose confessed, the Milwaukee police that he confessed to weren't actually aware of the crime that he was talking about. Obviously, you've got to remember that this was 33 years after Carrie's death, so the police that worked on the investigation into her murder all those years ago probably weren't around anymore. They had either sadly passed away or had retired by this point. I'm sure most of the detectives that worked for the Milwaukee Police Department in 2015 probably weren't even alive when this case took place in 1982. They may have not even been born yet, or at least they were just children when it happened. So when this man, Jose Ferreira, approached the police and said, "I need to confess to this murder that happened more than 3 decades ago," the police were just like, okay, we need to actually learn about this case. We need to dig out the cold case file. So after they read up on the case, Jose was interviewed by Detective Jim Hensley, and Jose went through his detailed confession. He told the detective his account of what happened that fateful day in March of 1982. Jose said that on the afternoon of the 16th of March 1982, he was at a party at the Mant family home. So all of those people, all those teenagers that previously said there was no party, had lied. Johnny Mant had lied. He did host a party that day whilst his parents were at work. And from what I can gather, the reason they all lied was because there was drugs and alcohol at this party. So I'm guessing all of the teenagers were just too scared of getting in trouble for this, and so they all decided to lie and say that a party just never took place. So anyway, Jose said that he was at Johnny Mant's party that afternoon, and after a short while, he noticed that 13-year-old Carrie Ann Jopak had joined in the party too. After getting suspended from school, instead of going home, she went to Johnny's house to the party. Jose told the police that he quite liked Carrie. I think he had a bit of a crush on her, and he said that at the party, Carrie actually came up to him. She started chatting to him, and she asked him if he had any alcohol that she could have, but he said no, he didn't. However, he did say that he had some weed and he offered her some, and Carrie accepted. So they went and stood together by a door in the man's house, and this door was the entrance to the basement. When you opened it, there were some stairs that led down to the basement. So they stood there. I believe they started smoking and sharing a joint, and then Jose asked Carrie if she wanted to go down to the basement with him. I read on one online source that the basement was kind of known as the makeout area, so it's clear that Jose wanted Carrie to go down there with him so that they could get together. And some reports state that initially Carrie said yes, she agreed to go down to the basement with him. However, I think Carrie very quickly realized what Jose's intentions were. She realized that the reason he wanted her to go down to the basement with him was because he wanted to get with her, and she didn't want that. So she said to him, actually, I don't want to go down there, I don't think it's a good idea. However, Jose was insistent. He had made up his mind that Carrie was going down to the basement with him, and he said to her, quote, "You are going downstairs." And when Carrie tried to walk away from him, he violently pushed her and she fell backwards. She fell backwards down the stairs into the basement, and during her fall, her head hit the railing on the staircase so hard that it snapped backwards, causing the C1 vertebrae bone in her neck to break, and as a result of this injury, Carrie died. Although Jose says that at first he didn't actually realize that Carrie was dead. He thought that she was just unconscious, and so he saw this as an opportunity to sexually assault her, and so he proceeded to fondle Carrie's breast whilst apparently telling her that he thought she was a very beautiful young girl. And it wasn't long after this when Jose realized that Carrie Ann wasn't actually breathing. He realized that he had killed her. When he pushed her and she fell back, her neck snapped. And he said that in that moment, he just panicked and he did not know what to do. He considered just fleeing the scene, just leaving the house and leaving Carrie's body in the basement for someone to find. However, he ultimately decided that that probably wouldn't be the best idea, because someone might have seen him by the basement door with Carrie. One of the other teenagers might have seen him with her, and if she was then found dead in the basement, they would know exactly who was responsible. And so instead of just leaving her in there, he decided that he needed to hide her body. And he apparently knew of this little area underneath the porch, underneath the decking in the man's back garden, where he could dig a hole. So he went through another door in the basement, which I believe led out directly to the garden. He grabbed a shovel and he started digging. And once he had dug a grave, he dragged Carrie's body outside, put her inside the grave in the fetal position, and he covered her up with soil. Once he finished, he stepped back and he actually said that he noticed that some of Carrie's hair was sticking out of the ground. So he picked up even more soil and he covered it. And unbelievably, no one actually saw him burying Carrie's body in the back garden. Even though it was the afternoon and it was still light outside, no one saw what he did. Obviously, all of the other teenagers were inside the house partying. None of them were outside. Jose was asked by the police if he had any assistance in this crime, if any of the other people at the party helped him to bury the body. However, he said no. He was insistent that no one else was involved. It was just him. So that was Jose's version of events, and the police have said that for the most part, they do believe it. They think that there may be one or two minor details that he left out so that it wouldn't look as bad, but on the whole, they do believe his account. They believe that he pushed Carrie and she fell back and broke her neck. And as we know, he was able to get away with it for a very, very long time. Carrie's body wasn't found until a year and a half after her death. And like I said said earlier, he was a person of interest in the case when a neighbour saw him near the scene of the crime on his knees and crying. So the police questioned him, but he denied everything, and they didn't have any solid evidence to prove that he was the killer, so he was let go. He was able to just carry on with his life as normal, and what's so disturbing and chilling is that in the years after Carrie's murder and before he confessed, he actually kept in contact with Carrie's own family. He would visit them, he went over to their house on occasion, he supported them, and he actually became kind of close to them. And the whole time they had absolutely no idea that he was the person responsible for Carrie's death. I cannot imagine how upset and betrayed they must have felt when they found out the truth. It's awful. But as I said, Jose went on to live his life. He later got married. I don't know if he had any children, but he did get married, and actually his wife was the very first person that he confessed to. They were actually in the middle of getting a divorce at the time, but shortly before Jose handed himself into the police in October of 2015, he rang his wife and he told her everything. He told her that he killed Carrie Ann Jopak at a party years and years earlier in 1982. Upon hearing this, his wife did get in contact with the police to report what he had said, and following the phone call to his wife, he confessed to another person. Jose actually rang a crisis hotline and spoke to one of the counsellors, and he told this counsellor about the murder, and according to reports, he also said to this counsellor that he wasn't sure whether or not he wanted to, quote, go out in a blaze of glory or in silence. But in the end, he clearly decided that he didn't want to go out in silence, because he then rang the Milwaukee news station and told them about the murder. And then following this, he contacted the Milwaukee Police Department and confessed to them. And you may be thinking, why the hell did he confess? Because he would have gotten away with this. Well, he did get away with it. It had been 33 years since Carrie's death, and he hadn't been caught, so why hand himself in now? Why not just take his secret to the grave? Well, it turns out that Jose had been battling addictions for a number of years now. I believe he was addicted to both drugs and alcohol, mainly alcohol, and he actually said that the reason he confessed was because he had been haunted by his victims' ghost or spirit for a number of years now. He said that he believed Carrie Ann had been haunting him, pushing him to confess, and he just could not get rid of her. He could not escape her. She would not leave him alone. So I believe this is partly what led to his addictions. He was drinking so much alcohol because he felt like he was being haunted by a ghost. And in the end, he thought that the only way Carrie's spirit would leave him alone was if he finally told the truth and he faced punishment for what he did. And Carrie's mother, Carolyn, has said that she completely believes this. She wholeheartedly believes that Carrie was haunting her killer, and she said that in a way that means that Carrie solved her own murder. The police didn't solve the case, Carrie did. She decided that she was going to take matters into her own hands and get justice for herself. So after Jose Ferreira confessed to the police, he was charged with second-degree murder, which meant that he could have faced around 20 years in prison. But he got himself a lawyer, and unbelievably, despite the fact that he had previously confessed, he'd given a detailed confession, he actually decided to plead not guilty. He was advised by his lawyer to plead not guilty. His defense team were confident that he might be able to get away with this because apart from his confession, there was no evidence linking him to the actual crime. Obviously, there was no forensic evidence in the case because Carrie's body was literally just a skeleton by the time she was found. And also the crime occurred in the early 80s anyway, when forensic technology wasn't really a thing. So like I said, apart from his confession, the police didn't really have any evidence to prove that he did it, and the prosecutors knew this, and they knew that that meant it was going to be very, very difficult to convict him of murder. There was a high chance that he would be found not guilty and would walk free due to the lack of evidence. And so because he decided to plead not guilty, the prosecutors decided to offer Jose a plea deal. They said that they would reduce his charges. Instead of charging him with second-degree murder, they would charge him with attempted second-degree sexual assault with use of force and false imprisonment for pushing Carrie into the basement. And they said, if you accept this plea deal, if you plead guilty to these charges, the court proceedings will be over a lot quicker and you will receive a much lighter sentence. And so Jose Ferreira accepted. He accepted this plea bargain and he pleaded guilty to the reduced charges. And he was sentenced to just 7 years in prison. 7 years for the life of the 13-year-old girl. But apparently that was the maximum that the judge could impose for what he was charged with. So at his sentencing, Jose Ferreira made a statement and he said to Carrie's family, quote, "I can't take back how it happened. I'm sorry. From the deepest pain in my heart, sorry." Carrie's family were, of course, not happy with Jose's sentence. They were very, very disappointed that he wasn't given longer in prison. However, at the same time, they said that they were grateful that finally, after so many years, they had answers. Finally, they had closure and Carrie got some form of justice for her death. From what I can gather, Jose Ferreira is still in prison to this day. He was sentenced in 2017, so 2 years after he confessed. So I believe that means he will be released around 2024 time. That is it for this case. That is the case of Carrie Ann Jopak. A very sad and frustrating case. I'm sure a lot of you guys will feel just as frustrated at the 7-year sentence as I do. As I said at the start of this video, this is, I think, one of the most insane cases I've ever covered. So I'm really, really looking forward to hearing what you guys think about this one. So please do let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Also let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can let me know in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly.